There is a liquid so cheap, so ordinary, and so brutally effective that most people walk past it without ever realizing what it can do. For less than the price of a gas station coffee, it can turn active rust into a sealed, stable surface that stops spreading instead of eating deeper. Not next month. Not after an expensive shop visit. Not after replacing half the metal on your vehicle. The reaction begins the moment it touches corrosion, and once it does, the orange decay that destroys tools, truck frames, trailer hitches, garden equipment, camp stoves, and body panels starts becoming something else entirely. That liquid is not rare. It is not futuristic. It does not require a mechanic, a lift, a sandblasting cabinet, or a body shop. You do not need a certification. You do not need a compressor. You do not need a $400 rust package from a dealership with a glossy brochure and a service advisor in a clean polo shirt. You need one small packet of a simple compound, warm water, and a brush. And that is exactly the problem. Because rust is not just a chemical reaction. Rust is a business model. Every year, people replace mufflers, brake lines, rocker panels, wheel arches, floor pans, tools, utility trailers, steel fencing, cast iron parts, outdoor gear, and farm hardware because corrosion keeps coming back. The system depends on that return. The parts store profits when the damage spreads. The repair shop profits when the metal weakens. The dealership profits when fear gets packaged as protection. The coatings companies profit when you believe rust must always be managed, never truly shut down at the source. But that story begins to fall apart the moment you learn what tannic acid does. Because this is not a paint that sits on top of rust and hopes for the best. This is not a cosmetic cover-up that hides the problem until the next wet season. This is chemistry aimed directly at the corrosion itself. Tannic acid reacts with iron oxide, the flaky orange-brown material you call rust, and converts it into a darker, more stable compound that bonds to the surface instead of continuing to crumble away. In plain English, it does not just hide rust, it changes what rust is. And people have known versions of this for far longer than the modern auto industry wants to admit. Long before branded rust converters showed up in hardware stores with aggressive labels and inflated prices, metalworkers noticed something strange. Iron tools exposed to certain plant-rich solutions aged differently. They darkened. They held up better. They resisted moisture longer. In workshops, tanneries, shipyards, and field camps, practical people kept rediscovering the same truth from different directions. Certain tannin-rich materials had an unusual relationship with iron. What looked like folk practice was actually chemistry being observed centuries before the chemistry had a formal name. Then modern industry arrived and did what modern industry always does when a cheap solution threatens an expensive cycle. It renamed it, diluted it, packaged it, marked it up, and sold it back as premium technology. Look closely at commercial rust converters today, and you begin to see the trick. Fancy labels, industrial language, claims of advanced conversion technology, high markups. But underneath the branding, many are still leaning on the same core idea: tannin-based rust conversion. The chemistry is old, the bottle is new, the margin is the real innovation. And the reason this matters to you is simple. Rust does not care whether it is attacking a vintage truck, a machete in your camping gear, a set of pliers in a damp shed, a trailer tongue in the rain, or the underside of the vehicle you depend on every day. Once corrosion starts, it spreads quietly, then suddenly. One season becomes 3. Surface staining becomes pitting. Pitting becomes weakness. Weakness becomes replacement. And replacement becomes another bill you were never supposed to question. But what if the whole cycle breaks with a solution that costs almost nothing? What if the answer was never locked in some high-end workshop at all? What if the most important rust treatment is the one nobody makes real money from? Because once you see how this chemistry works, and how long it has quietly survived behind modern branding, you will never look at a rusted tool, a corroded truck frame, or a $30 rust converter bottle the same way again. What makes rust so destructive is not the color, it is the process. Most people see orange metal and think the damage is sitting on the surface like dust. It is not. Rust is metal actively breaking apart. Oxygen and moisture are pulling iron into a new form, and that new form is weak, porous, flaky, and hungry to keep spreading. That is why sanding alone does not solve it. That is why painting over active rust often fails. And that is why so many fixes turn into repeat jobs. Tannic acid works differently. Instead of pretending the rust is gone, it reacts with it. The orange iron oxide meets tannic acid and begins turning into a darker, more stable material called iron tannate. That is the moment everything changes. The crumbling surface starts becoming a bonded layer instead of an advancing infection. You are not covering over the problem and hoping for mercy. You are forcing the corrosion into a form that stops behaving like loose, active decay. That is why treated rust changes color. the ugly orange-brown surface begins shifting toward blue-black or dark charcoal. That color change is not cosmetic. It is evidence that the chemistry is happening right in front of you. And once you understand that, the whole rust industry starts sounding very different. Because what are most people told? Sand more, grind deeper, buy stronger primer, buy specialty paint, reapply every season, pay for undercoating, replace the part if it gets worse. Come back next year, come back again after winter. Keep buying, keep treating, keep replacing. Rust is one of the perfect recurring problems. It scares people, it spreads slowly enough to sell maintenance around it, and it affects almost everything made from steel. Cars, trailers, outdoor tools, gates, hinges, grills, garden equipment, workshop hardware, camp gear, even the hidden metal underneath vehicles people assume still looks fine. That makes corrosion incredibly profitable, not because it is impossible to stop, but because most people are taught to fight symptoms instead of changing the reaction itself. And that is where this old chemistry becomes dangerous to the business. Because once a person learns that a cheap tannic acid solution can convert existing rust, stabilize the surface, and prepare it for a protective top coat, that person stops being dependent on expensive mystery products. He starts reading labels. He starts asking what the active ingredient actually is. He starts noticing that the advanced converter in the branded bottle may be doing something very similar to a much simpler mix that costs a fraction as much. This is where the average truck owner, camper, mechanic, homesteader, or tool collector gets trapped. They are not paying for magic. They are paying for packaging, convenience, and ignorance. A new label, a harder-sounding formula name, a bigger promise on the bottle, and suddenly old chemistry becomes premium technology. But rust does not care about the label. It only cares whether the reaction was stopped. And in the next part, that is where this story gets bigger. Because this was not just some garage trick passed between a few old-timers. Versions of this knowledge showed up in workshops, shipyards, military maintenance systems, and old-world trades long before modern auto care turned corrosion into a billion-dollar cycle. Long before rust converters were sold in plastic bottles with industrial branding, people who worked with metal had already seen the pattern with their own eyes. A blade left in damp air would bloom orange within days. A wagon fitting exposed to rain would begin to pit. Iron tools stored through winter without protection came out rough, stained, and weakened. But in place after place, from different trades and different climates, metal workers noticed that certain plant-rich liquids did something unusual when they touched oxidized iron. The surface darkened, the spread slowed, the metal seemed to hold. They did not describe it with modern chemical terms. They described it the way working people always do. This works, that fails, keep using the one that works. Tanners were among the first to stumble into it again and again. Bark-rich soaking vats, especially those loaded with oak, chestnut, or other tannin-heavy materials, had a strange effect on iron tools that came into contact with them. Knives, hooks, fittings, and workshop hardware exposed to those dark solutions often came out looking different, less raw, less orange, less vulnerable than untreated metal. Blacksmiths noticed, carpenters noticed, armorers noticed, shipworkers noticed, and once a useful trick proves itself in hard conditions, it spreads fast. That is how real knowledge travels, not through polished advertising, through repetition, survival, and results. By the time industrial chemistry caught up and started explaining why tannins react with iron oxides, generations of practical workers had already been using plant extracts, bark brews, dark washes, oils, and preserved solutions to hold corrosion back on everything from tools and fittings to storage hardware and transport parts. The names changed from region to region, the plant source changed, the exact strength changed, but the pattern stayed the same. Tannin-rich treatment and rusted iron had a very different relationship than plain water, plain oil, or bare exposure. And that matters because it destroys the fantasy that rust conversion is some recent breakthrough invented by a modern brand. It is not. Modern brands refined it, bottled it, standardized it, and sold it. But they did not create the basic reaction, they monetized it. That is the difference. Once the industrial age accelerated, corrosion became even more expensive. More steel, more machines, more transport, more exposed parts, more bridges, ships, rail systems, farm tools, engines, trailers, and infrastructure. And with that explosion came a simple economic truth. Anyone who could slow, stabilize, or convert rust could save serious money. That made anti-corrosion chemistry valuable, but it also made it marketable. And once something becomes marketable, the cheapest version rarely gets the loudest promotion. The loudest promotion goes to the version with the best margin. That is why old, practical solutions often disappear in plain sight. They do not vanish because they failed, they vanish because they are too simple, too cheap, too easy to understand, and too hard to build a dependency loop around. A solution you can mix yourself in a bucket is not nearly as profitable as a solution you must trust, repurchase, and feel unqualified to replace. So the story changed. Instead of, here is an old reaction that converts rust, the message became, here is a specialized product you need experts to understand. Instead of, you can stabilize this yourself, it became, bring it in, book the service, buy the treatment, repeat next season. Instead of chemistry people could learn, it became branded mystery. And that rebranding worked on millions of people because fear does the selling. Rust feels relentless. It feels like once it begins, you are already losing. So when a product promises rescue, most people do not ask deeper questions. They do not ask whether the active chemistry is ancient. They do not ask whether cheaper options exist. They do not ask whether the same core reaction has been hiding in simpler form the entire time. But once you do ask, the spell breaks. Because the truth is not that rust is unbeatable. The truth is that most people were never taught the difference between coating over corrosion and converting it. And in the next part, that is exactly where we go. Into the money, the markups, the modern rust converter game, and why a problem this common became one of the easiest ways to keep people paying forever. By the time rust protection became a full-blown industry, the chemistry was no longer the most valuable part of the business. The real money was in the framing. Take an ordinary vehicle owner. He notices rust starting around a wheel arch, a trailer frame, a truck bed seam, or the underside of the chassis after a wet winter. He is not thinking about iron oxide, tannins, conversion layers, or molecular stability. He is thinking about repair bills, safety, resale value, whether the damage is already out of control. That fear is where the entire system steps in. The parts store sells the emergency fix. The dealership sells the premium package. The body shop sells the labor. The aftermarket sells the replacement panel. The coatings company sells the branded treatment. And every one of them makes more money if rust stays a recurring problem instead of becoming a solvable one. That is the key. A recurring problem is worth far more than a permanent lesson. Once rust becomes something the average person feels helpless against, the door opens for every kind of markup. A bottle that costs very little to formulate becomes a professional-grade converter. A simple protective treatment becomes a corrosion management system. A dealership spray package becomes a $500 to $2,000 add-on dressed up like aerospace technology. Even when the product works, the pricing often has very little to do with rare chemistry and a lot to do with confidence, branding, and the customer's lack of information. That is why label language matters so much. The moment a cheap idea is wrapped in technical wording, most people stop asking what is actually inside. They see advanced oxide conversion technology, industrial inhibitor blend, or proprietary anti-corrosion system, and their brain files it under specialized expertise. But underneath that polished language, many rust converter products are still relying on very familiar chemistry, tannin-based conversion paired with binders, solvents, or additives that make the product easier to package and sell at a higher margin. And this is where the average buyer loses. Not because the chemistry is fake, because the chemistry is old. He is often paying premium money for a branded version of a reaction that has existed far longer than the branding around it. The bottle looks modern, the pricing sounds serious, the copy on the label makes it feel exclusive, but the underlying principle is often much simpler than the marketing wants him to believe. That same game spreads far beyond vehicles. Campers replace rusted tent stakes and stove parts. Homesteaders replace tools left in damp sheds. Trailer owners patch corrosion year after year. Farmers fight rust on gates, chains, brackets, and implements. Collectors watch valuable old tools degrade while searching for expensive restoration systems. And all the while, the industry trains them to think in cycles. Inspect, buy, reapply, replace, repeat. That cycle is incredibly profitable because if people ever fully understood the difference between hiding rust and converting it, a lot of expensive products would suddenly look less magical. A lot of services would start looking like convenience instead of necessity, and a lot of specialized protection packages would begin to feel like what they often are: marked up reassurance sold to anxious owners. Which brings us to the most important part of the entire script. Not the history, not the marketing, not the industry language, the actual method. Because once you know how to use this chemistry in a practical, simple, real-world way, the entire conversation shifts. You stop being the customer they can scare, you become the person who understands what to do. Here's the part that matters most, because none of this means anything if it stays trapped at the level of theory. If you have a rusted tool, a trailer tongue, a truck frame, a set of brackets, old hardware, a steel gate, a camp stove, a machete, a shovel head, or any other piece of oxidized steel that is still structurally worth saving, the process is brutally simple. First, remove the loose junk. Not every trace of discoloration, not every stain, not every dark spot. What you want gone is the flaky, weak, crusted material that is no longer bonded well to the metal. A wire brush, coarse pad, scraper, or stiff steel wool is enough for that. You are not trying to polish the metal into mirror shine, you are trying to knock away the rust that has already lifted and separated so the solution can reach what is still attached. Then make the treatment. A simple tannic acid solution mixed with warm water is enough to begin the conversion. No workshop lift, no compressor, no spray booth, no paid appointment, no mystery package. Brush it on evenly over the rusted surface and let the chemistry do what expensive fear-based marketing never explains clearly. React with the corrosion itself. As it works, the orange surface begins to darken. That color shift is the moment the story changes. The weak, active rust you could scrape with your fingernail begins turning into a darker, more stable conversion layer. Not magic, not hype, just a direct chemical reaction between the tannin compound and the oxidized iron. Let it dry fully. If the surface was heavily rusted, apply a second coat. Give the reaction time to finish. Once the metal has converted and dried, now you protect it properly. Oil for tools, wax for certain gear, paint for exposed steel, undercoating for vulnerable vehicle areas. The conversion step handles the corrosion. The top layer helps defend the metal from what comes next. That is the whole idea, not endless replacement, not yearly panic, not cosmetic cover-ups. Convert what is active, seal what is exposed, break the cycle. And that cycle matters more than most people realize, because rust is one of those quiet losses that drains money a little at a time until suddenly the bill becomes large enough to feel like fate. A tool gets replaced, a bracket snaps, a panel weakens, a trailer looks worse every season. The underside of a vehicle becomes something you stop wanting to inspect. People call that normal. Industry calls it maintenance. But a lot of it is preventable decay made profitable by confusion. That is why this knowledge matters. Not because it is glamorous, because it is useful. It puts control back in the hands of the person who owns the metal, uses the tool, drives the truck, pulls the trailer, maintains the gear, and refuses to keep funding a problem that gets sold back to him every year with a new label and a bigger price. So the next time you see rust, do not just see damage, see the fork in the road. One path is the path they trained you to take. Ignore it, fear it, overpay to hide it, then replace the part when it returns. The other path is simpler. Understand the reaction, stop it at the source, stabilize the surface, protect the metal, keep moving. That is how old practical knowledge survives. Not in museums, not in corporate brochures, in garages, sheds, camps, workshops, driveways, and backyards, where useful truth still matters more than branding. And once you understand that, rust stops looking like an inevitable sentence. It starts looking like a problem someone made a fortune teaching you to misunderstand.